The wind came low and steady across the dry plains, carrying dust that shimmered gold beneath the late afternoon sun. The land was quiet, except for the faint whistle of wind slipping through mesquite branches and the slow creak of saddle leather. The river ahead wasn't much of a river anymore, just a wide stretch of shallow water snaking through cracked earth. It was the only thing that looked alive in that lonely country. She stood near it, her boots sinking slightly in the damp sand, one hand steady on her belly, the other clutching a rifle that was far too heavy for her trembling arms. Her breath came quick. Behind her, the shadows of 3 men on horseback stretched long and dark across the sand, and the sound of hooves stopped a few yards away. She turned then, slow and careful, her sunburned face streaked with sweat and dust. Her voice shook, but her eyes were clear and hard. "Don't come any closer. I'm pregnant," she said, and for a long second, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The 3 Apaches stopped before the water. Their horses shifted restlessly, snorting through dry nostrils. The one in front, the oldest of the 3, studied her with a look that wasn't anger, just something quieter curiosity, maybe pity. She didn't know. She only knew she couldn't let them cross. It hadn't been more than a week since she'd buried her husband up in the hills. The ground was too hard to dig deep, and she'd done what she could with her blistered hands. He'd gone out to find help after the wagon broke down near the borderlands, but a storm had rolled through that night. By morning, she'd found him under a cottonwood tree, cold and still, his rifle empty. She hadn't cried much then, there hadn't been time for it. There was the baby to think about, and the long road ahead through country that didn't take kindly to strangers. The Apaches had been following her since dawn. She didn't know what they wanted, only that she couldn't stop moving. The river was supposed to be her crossing her chance to put distance between her and them before night fell. But now, standing there with the sun dropping low and the water glinting red, she realized she'd run out of places to go. The leader of the 3 raised his hand slowly, palm out, like he meant no harm. He said something in his own tongue, quiet and measured. She couldn't make out the words, but his tone wasn't sharp. It almost sounded like a question. She gripped the rifle tighter, her knuckles pale beneath the dirt. "Said don't come closer," she repeated, louder this time. The sound of her voice echoed off the canyon walls and scattered into the wind. Behind the Apaches, the sun was dipping lower, setting fire to the horizon. The world glowed copper and blood orange. Her horse, tied to a nearby tree, stomped nervously, sensing her fear. Every nerve in her body was taut. She didn't want to shoot, but she couldn't let them near her either. The river wasn't deep, but it was enough of a line. As long as they stayed on their side, she might make it through the night. She thought of the baby then, the small flutter of life she'd begun to feel every now and then when she lay still at night. It wasn't much, just a whisper beneath her ribs, but it reminded her what she was fighting for. She wasn't going to let that child come into the world scared and alone, not out here. One of the younger Apaches dismounted, slow and deliberate. He crouched by the water's edge and dipped his hand in, watching the ripples move toward her boots. She raised the rifle a little higher. The older man said something sharp in their language, and the young one froze. Then he straightened up and stepped back beside his horse. She could see the respect or maybe fear in the way he moved. Whatever it was, they were listening to the older one. The silence stretched on. Crickets started to chirp in the brush, and a lone hawk circled high above, its cry fading in the wind. She felt her strength slipping, the rifle growing heavier with every passing second. She hadn't eaten since sunrise, just a piece of hard bread and some water she'd boiled in a tin cup. Her head throbbed with the weight of exhaustion, but she couldn't let her guard drop. The older Apache leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, pointed to the sky, then to her, then back toward the north. She didn't understand, but something in his expression told her he wasn't threatening her. Maybe he was warning her about the storm clouds gathering in the distance. She turned her head, and sure enough, a dark front was rolling in from the north, the kind that came with wind, rain, and trouble. She swallowed hard. If the storm hit before she found shelter, she wouldn't last long. Not in her condition. Her hands trembled as she lowered the rifle just an inch, torn between fear and the small. Stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, they didn't mean her harm. But then again, she couldn't take chances. Out here, trust could get you killed faster than a bullet. She remembered the night she and her husband had left the town behind. chasing the promise of land they could call their own. Folks had warned them about this part of the country, how the borderlands were restless, how the Apaches still rode through the canyons at night, how travelers disappeared without a trace. But her husband had laughed it off. "We'll be fine," he'd said. "People just like to tell ghost stories." He'd always been too brave for his own good. Now, standing alone by that dying river, she realized those stories had always held a piece of truth. There were ghosts in this land, not just the ones in the hills or the wind, but in the hearts of those who'd come here thinking they could tame it. The first drops of rain hit the sand, darkening it to the color of old coffee. The Apaches turned their faces to the sky, murmuring to one another. Lightning flashed in the distance, painting the cliffs in stark light. She knew she had to move. She couldn't stay by the river much longer, not with the storm rolling in and the night close behind. She took one careful step backward, keeping the rifle steady. "I'm going now," she said, her voice breaking. "You stay where you are." The older man didn't move. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if to say he understood. She didn't know why, but that small gesture, simple as it was, made something shift inside her. Maybe mercy still had a place in this wild land after all. She turned to her horse, fumbling with the reins. The storm wind whipped at her dress and thunder rolled across the sky. When she looked back over her shoulder, the Apaches were still there, watching. The older one had dismounted now, standing knee-deep in the shallows of the river, his eyes on her. She couldn't tell what he meant to do, and that uncertainty wrapped around her like the storm itself. Then, as a bolt of lightning split the sky open, she saw movement in the far brush beyond the river, flicker of motion, a glint of metal. There was someone else out there, not Apache, not her. Someone watching them both. Her breath caught. She raised the rifle again, heart pounding in her throat. The old man turned sharply, calling out to the others. Horses whinnied and stamped. The rain came harder now, thick sheets that blurred the world into gray. The sound of thunder swallowed her words as she tried to speak. The wind tore at the trees, and the river began to rise fast, swirling with muddy water. She stepped back toward the bank, torn between running for cover and staying to see what danger waited beyond the storm. Somewhere in that roaring mix of rain and thunder, a rifle cracked a single shot that echoed through the canyon. The Apaches froze. Her horse reared. The sound still hung in the air when she dropped to her knees by the water. Clutching her belly, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know who had fired. She didn't know who would survive the night. All she knew was that the storm had arrived, and nothing in this wild, untamed land would ever be the same again. The shot rang through the valley like the cry of something wounded, and for a long heartbeat, the whole world seemed to stop breathing. She crouched low in the wet sand, clutching her belly as the rain came down harder. Her ears rang with the echo, but no other shots followed. The Apaches stood motionless on the far side of the river, their eyes scanning the cliffs beyond. Lightning lit the sky again, revealing nothing but sheets of rain and shifting shadows. Whoever had fired that shot was hidden, waiting. She stayed still, afraid to move or even breathe too loud. The rifle in her hands felt slick with rain, her fingers slipping against the cold metal. Her horse tugged at the reins, panicked by the thunder and the sudden noise. She whispered to it, voice trembling, "Easy now, easy." It didn't call much, but it stayed. That was all she could hope for. The Apaches had spread out now. One of them dismounted and crouched low, checking the ground near the water. The older man pointed toward the ridge where the sound had come from. He seemed to know this kind of danger well. It wasn't her they feared anymore, it was whoever had taken that shot. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Someone else was out there, but that didn't make her safer. Out here, strangers were as dangerous as storms. She tried to think. The storm would soon make travel impossible, but staying put meant she'd be trapped between the Apaches and whoever lurked in those hills. Her husband had taught her one thing before he died: never wait for trouble to find you. She needed shelter, and there was only one place she could think of: the old trading post she'd seen 2 days back, half burned and abandoned. It wasn't far, maybe an hour's ride if she pushed hard. She wiped the rain from her face and began inching toward her horse. Her boots sank deep in the mud. Every step felt heavier, her breath short with fear and exhaustion. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and she felt the ground tremble. When she looked back across the river, the Apaches were gone, vanished. She blinked through the rain, trying to find them, but the storm had swallowed everything. The world was just water and wind now. She swung herself into the saddle and turned the horse north, letting instinct guide her more than sight. The animal hesitated, reluctant to move through the rising river, but she urged it on with what strength she had left. The cold water rose to her knees before they reached the other side. When they finally made it across, she looked back once. Nothing moved but the trees bending under the storm. She rode until the rain softened into mist, until her body felt too heavy to hold upright. Then, through the fog, she saw the outline of the old post. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the walls had fallen, but it was still standing, still offering something that looked like safety. She guided the horse toward it and dismounted with stiff, aching legs. The wind moaned through the gaps in the wood. Inside, it smelled of dust and smoke. The counters were broken, and old barrels lay scattered across the floor. She found a dry corner near the back, where the roof still held. She set her rifle beside her and sank down, drawing her shawl tight around her shoulders. For the first time since morning, she closed her eyes. Her heartbeat began to slow, though her mind stayed sharp, watching the memory of that gunshot play again and again. She couldn't stop wondering who had fired it. The Apaches hadn't attacked her. They meant her harm. They would have done it before the rain came. So who else was out here? Traders? Drifters? Bandits? The borderlands had no shortage of men who lived by taking from others. Maybe one of them had seen the small fire she'd lit the night before and decided to follow her trail. A distant crack of thunder made her flinch. She opened her eyes and saw movement through the cracks in the wooden wall, a flicker of light. Faint, but steady. Someone had a campfire out there. She crawled closer to the opening and peered through. The rain had stopped, and the moon was beginning to rise behind thin clouds. Across the clearing near the old corral, she saw the glow of a small fire and the shadow of a man kneeling beside it. He was too far away to see clearly, but she could tell he wasn't one of the Apaches. His clothes looked like those of a frontiersman-worn hat. Long coat, rifle strapped across his back. Her pulse quickened. Was he the one who'd fired the shot? She couldn't risk calling out, not yet. She'd wait, watch, and see what he did. The man poked at the fire, then turned his head toward the post as if listening. She froze, not daring to move. After a long moment, he rose and walked toward the building, slow and careful. Each step sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the wet silence. She backed away from the wall, grabbed her rifle, and held it ready. Her hands were shaking, but she set her jaw and took aim at the doorway. The hinges creaked, and the door swung open. The man stopped in the frame, his outline black against the pale moonlight. His voice came low and calm. "You don't have to point that thing. I ain't here to hurt you." She didn't lower the rifle. "Stay right there." He nodded, lifting his hands to show they were empty. "Enough. I saw the Apaches following you earlier. Figured you might need help." "Help?" she asked, her tone sharp with distrust. "You think firing a gun near me in the middle of a storm was help?" He sighed. "That wasn't at you. Someone else was watching from the ridge. I scared them off." She stared at him, uncertain if she should believe him. "How do I know you're not lying?" "You don't," he said simply. "But you're welcome to keep that gun on me till you figure it out." There was something steady in his voice, tired but not cruel. She studied him for a long moment. His face was half hidden by the brim of his hat, but his eyes caught the light, gray and watchful. Looked like a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. Finally, she lowered the rifle a little, though she didn't put it down. "What do you want?" "Just a dry spot for the night," he said. "You can have the corner. I'll stay by the door." She hesitated, then nodded. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. Sound of the wind faded, replaced by the soft crackle of his fire. He took off his coat and hung it near the flames too dry. For a while, neither of them spoke. The rain outside eased into a whisper, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. She finally broke the silence. "You said someone else was out there?" He nodded slowly. "Could have been a scout. It could have been worse. This part of the territory draws all kinds. Why were you following me then?" "I wasn't," he said. "I've been tracking the same 3 men for days. When I saw you and those Apaches by the river, I thought they'd caught up to you. Guess I was wrong, she frowned. You mean you don't know them? No, he said, but I know they weren't hunting you. They were warning you. That made her pause. Warning me about what? He met her eyes. There's something moving through this land lately, men who ride without banners, taking what they want, burning what they can't. They've hit 2 settlements this month. The Apaches keep to their ground, but these men don't care about borders. Her stomach turned cold. You think that's who fired that shot? Could be, he said. They're not far behind. The wind rattled the boards, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. She looked toward the window, half expecting to see shadows moving in the dark. You should leave then, she said. If they're after you. He shook his head. They'll find this place soon enough. Might as well have company when they do. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need anyone's help, but she didn't have the strength. The truth was, she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of holding everything together for the sake of the child she carried. So she just nodded. The night grew deeper, the fire dimmer. He sat near the door, sharpening a knife in slow, steady strokes. She lay against the wall, watching the shadows flicker across his face. Outside, coyotes cried in the distance, their howls blending with the wind. She wanted to ask his name, but something held her back. Maybe it didn't matter. Out here, names didn't mean much. Survival did. When she finally drifted toward sleep, she thought she heard footsteps in the distance, crunching over wet ground. Her eyes flew open, and she met his gaze. He'd heard it too. He reached for his rifle, his expression turning cold and alert. The sound came again, closer this time, soft, deliberate. Someone was circling the trading post. The fire flickered low, and the room filled with the sound of their breathing, tense and shallow. She clutched her belly, whispering a prayer into the dark. Whatever waited outside had found them. Before the night was over, one way or another, it would make its presence known. The sound outside grew sharper, heavier, like someone dragging a boot through wet gravel. The man by the door motioned for her to stay quiet. The firelight made his shadow stretch across the wall, long and tense. He moved slow, lifting the rifle, his steps measured and silent. The wind had stopped, but the air still carried that electric feeling before something bad happens. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Through the narrow crack between the boards, a faint shape moved near the corral, then another and another. Whoever they were, there were at least 3 of them. The man's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the back of the room where she crouched, pointing to a loose plank in the wall. If they come in shooting, you crawl out that way, he whispered. Don't wait for me. I'm not leaving, she whispered back, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. Not unless I have to. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and turned back to the door, steadying his aim. The faint glow of moonlight caught the edge of his rifle barrel. The tension stretched thin between them like a wire ready to snap. The first voice outside came rough and low. Looks like someone's already here. Another voice answered, higher and impatient. Then we flush him out. She felt the breath catch in her throat. The man looked over his shoulder at her once, his expression unreadable, and then he stepped into position beside the doorway. The door swung open fast, slamming against the wall. A burst of cold air swept through the room, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder. 2 men stood in the doorway, rifles raised, their faces half hidden beneath wide hats and mud-smeared scarves. For a split second, everyone froze, caught between light and shadow. Then the first shot cracked, echoing off the walls. She dropped to the floor, covering her ears as splinters flew from the wall. The man beside her fired back, the flash lighting his face in harsh bursts. The attackers ducked for cover outside. She could hear them shouting to one another, boots thudding against the porch. He turned to her, voice sharp. Go now. She hesitated, then crawled toward the back wall, her knees scraping against the rough boards. The rain had started again, pattering against the roof like 1,000 tiny drums. She pushed against the loose plank until it gave way, revealing the narrow gap behind. Cold air rushed in. She turned back one last time. He was still by the door, calm but focused, reloading fast. When she slipped out into the darkness, the rain soaked her dress instantly. The world smelled of wet dirt and gun smoke. She crouched behind the remains of an old wagon, watching the flashes of light from inside. Every shot made her flinch. She could hear the men shouting, their voices wild and angry. They weren't bandits looking for food, they were hunting. She pressed her hand against her stomach, whispering, "Hold on, just hold on." A sudden figure moved from behind the corral, crouching low. She froze, trying to make out the shape. Then the lightning flared, and she saw the markings on his coat, the pattern of beads and leather she'd seen earlier that day. One of the Apaches looked at her across the distance, then toward the trading post, where gunfire still cracked through the storm. He didn't raise a weapon. Instead, he lifted his hand palm open, signaling her to stay low. She didn't know if she should trust him, but there was something steady in his movement, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. He slipped past her, silent as smoke, and disappeared into the brush behind the attackers. She waited, holding her breath. Then a yell split the night, followed by a scuffle and a heavy thud. The gunfire slowed, then stopped altogether. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. She waited, counting her breaths, unsure who had survived. Then she heard footsteps, 2 sets, one dragging slightly. The door creaked again, and the man from the trading post stumbled out, his sleeve torn and blood running down his arm. Behind him, the Apache moved, steady and watchful. When their eyes met, she felt the air shift again. The man lowered his rifle slightly. "You knew him?" he asked her. She shook her head. "He followed me from the river." "I thought he meant harm." The Apache looked between them, speaking in low tones the man seemed to partly understand. Says the man translated. "The others weren't Apaches. They were riders from down south. Raiders. Same ones I told you about." She swallowed hard. "How many?" "Too many," the man said. "And if they find this place, they won't stop at burning it." The Apache pointed toward the hills where the storm clouds were breaking apart. He spoke again, his words soft but urgent. The man nodded. "He says we can reach his people by dawn if we ride through the canyon." Her stomach tightened. "You think we should trust him?" The man met her gaze, tired but firm. "Right now, he's the only reason we're still breathing. That's enough for me." The Apache turned to gather the fallen men's weapons, moving quickly and efficiently. Didn't look at them again until he was ready. Then he gestured toward the trail. The man helped her mount her horse, tying the reins with one hand. His injured arm shook, but he didn't complain. She could tell he was running on pure will now. They rode out under a thin moon, the wet ground shining silver in the faint light. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy, charged with something unseen. The Apache led them into the canyon, where the walls rose high on both sides. The sound of water dripping from the cliffs echoed like whispers. As they rode, she found herself studying the man who had saved her, both of them, really. She didn't even know their names. Out here, that didn't seem to matter. What mattered was trust, and trust was built in silence, not words. Hours passed, marked only by the rhythm of hooves and the faint call of nightbirds. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves howled, their voices rolling through the canyon. The Apache paused once, listening, his eyes scanning the ridges above. Then he motioned for them to keep moving. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, her strength was nearly gone. The land opened up again, revealing a narrow valley lined with tall pines and scattered boulders. Smoke rose faintly from somewhere ahead, a small camp. The Apache dismounted and walked toward it, calling out softly in his language. Shapes began to emerge from the trees, cautious but not hostile. Women, children, a few older men. She realized then that this was his people's camp, the same ones the settlers had warned her about. Only now, seeing them, she felt no fear. They looked as tired and wary as she felt. The leader spoke with an older woman, then turned back to her and the man. He gestured toward a tent near the fire. "Says you can rest," the man said quietly. "They'll keep watch." She nodded, her body trembling from exhaustion. She slid off the horse and sank to the ground, feeling the warmth of the fire against her face. The man sat nearby, wrapping a strip of cloth around his arm. The Apache helped him without a word, his movements steady and careful. For the first time in days, she felt almost safe. But under that thin sense of peace, the question still burned. Who were those men who attacked? Why had they been following her trail at all? And why had the Apache's people, the settlers, feared themselves to protect her? She watched the smoke rise into the pale morning sky, carrying the scent of pine and ash. The wind shifted, cold and sharp, bringing with it the distant sound of horses. She turned her head, heart racing. The Apache looked up too, frowning. "They found us," the man said quietly. The camp moved fast, the quiet breaking in an instant. Women gathered children, men grabbed bows and rifles. The Apache who had led them here said something to the man, voice low but urgent. "What's he saying?" she asked. "He says they'll hold them off," the man replied. "We need to move north toward the mountains. There's an old mission there. Stone walls, high ground." She felt her chest tighten. "Can't just leave them." He met her eyes. "If we stay, that baby won't live to see another sunrise." Her throat went dry. She looked around at the faces of the Apache women, the quiet courage in their eyes, and felt the pull of guilt twist inside her. But deep down, she knew he was right. As the first shots echoed from the edge of the valley, the man took her hand and helped her onto her horse again. The Apache gave a final nod before turning back toward the fight, his figure swallowed by the rising dust and the cries of war. They rode hard toward the north, the morning sun breaking through the clouds. Behind them, smoke began to rise again, thick and dark against the sky. She didn't look back. Not yet. The only thing that mattered now was the life she carried and the uncertain road still waiting ahead. The sun rose fast behind them, spilling harsh light across the valley as smoke curled into the brightening sky. Her hands trembled on the reins as the horse galloped over uneven ground, every jolt sending pain up her arms. The wind stung her eyes, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind them, gunfire echoed faintly sharp cracks that carried across the open plain. She tried not to think about the Apache camp, about the people they had left behind to face whatever rode out of that smoke. She only focused on the path ahead, the jagged outline of the mountains standing tall and gray against the horizon. The man rode beside her, his injured arm tied close to his body, his face pale and set with determination. He glanced over at her now and then, checking to see if she could keep pace. "We'll reach cover before noon," he said, though his voice sounded strained. "There's a pass through those rocks. Once we're over, they won't be able to follow easy." She didn't answer. Her throat was too dry, her fear too thick to swallow. She kept one hand on her belly, feeling the faint rhythmic movement inside, proof that the child still lived. That single thought pushed her forward. The trail grew steeper as they climbed into the foothills. Dust rose from the horse's hooves, turning golden in the sunlight. The man slowed his horse just enough for her to catch up. He looked exhausted, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes. "You holding up?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she was. "How much farther?" He looked toward the peaks. "Couple more miles. There's a spring near the old mission. We'll rest there." The word mission sounded strange to her ears, like something out of an old story. She'd never seen one before, only heard travelers talk about them: stone walls, tall arches, and crosses that reached for the sky. She tried to picture it now, standing silent in the wild land, waiting for souls like theirs to stumble in. The ground leveled out as they entered a narrow gorge. The walls rose high on either side, streaked with red and gray. The air grew cooler, shaded by the cliffs. She let out a slow breath, grateful for the break from the relentless sun. The sound of running water reached her ears, a stream cutting through the rocks ahead. As they rode deeper into the gorge, something felt wrong. The air was too still, the birds too quiet. The man must have felt it too, because he pulled his horse to a stop, eyes scanning the ridge above them. "Don't like this," he muttered. "Too quiet." She followed his gaze but saw nothing but stone and shadow. "You think they're close?" "They're hunters," he said. "I'll wait till we're cornered." The word sent a chill through her. She looked back down the trail, half expecting to see riders emerging from the haze behind them. Nothing yet. But she could feel it, the same kind of pressure that comes before lightning strikes. He urged his horse forward, keeping close to the rock wall. "Stay beside me," he said. "If something happens, head for that spring. Don't stop for anything." They rode in silence for another stretch until the gorge opened suddenly into a wide clearing. There it was, the old mission, stood half in ruins, its walls cracked and faded by time, its bell tower leaning to one side. The wooden doors were gone, and vines had grown up through the stone arches. Still, it felt like a sanctuary in the wilderness. She dismounted carefully, her legs weak from the long ride. The man led both horses toward the spring, which bubbled clear and cold from a patch of mossy rock. He let them drink, then filled his canteen and handed it to her. She took a long swallow, the water washing some of the dust from her throat. He moved to the edge of the clearing, scanning the canyon mouth again. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, "and we'll see what comes next." She sat against one of the fallen pillars, watching him. He looked like a man who had been running his whole life from war, from guilt, from ghosts he didn't name. And now, somehow, she had become part of that running. "What happens if they find us?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then we make our stand." His calmness scared her more than his words. She wanted to believe they could outrun whatever hunted them, but deep down, she knew the land didn't let anyone escape for long. As the morning wore on, the wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of smoke and dust. The man tensed, eyes narrowing toward the canyon. "They're coming," he said quietly. Her pulse quickened. "How many?" He shouldered his rifle, his voice low. "More than we can count." She struggled to her feet, every instinct telling her to hide. He pointed toward the inner part of the mission where the stone walls still stood high. "Inside. Find cover." She obeyed, moving quickly through the broken doorway into what had once been a chapel. The roof was gone, and sunlight streamed through the gaps, painting golden patterns across the cracked floor. A weathered cross leaned against the far wall, half buried in debris. She crouched behind an altar made of old wood and prayed without words. Outside, she heard the man's voice calling out a warning, or maybe a bluff. Then came the answer, the pounding of hooves, the clatter of metal, the low shouts of riders closing in. The sound grew louder until it filled the canyon. Gunfire broke out, sharp and deafening. She covered her ears as the echoes bounced off the stone. Dust fell from the walls with every shot. The horses outside screamed in panic. She could smell the acrid bite of powder drifting in. A figure stumbled through the doorway. It was the man, blood running down his temple, his rifle smoking. "They're circling," he said breathlessly. "We've got to hold them off till dark." She helped him to the wall, trying to steady his shaking hands. "You can't fight them alone." He gave her a quick, grim smile. Wasn't planning to. He nodded toward her rifle leaning by the door. "You ever shoot before?" She hesitated. "My husband taught me some. Then now's the time to remember." Her heart pounded so hard it hurt, but she grabbed the rifle and followed him to the window slit. Outside, shapes moved between the rock's dark forms, darting in and out of view. She took a breath and fired once, the recoil jolting her shoulder. One of the riders fell, and for a moment she couldn't believe it had been her doing. The man fired beside her, reloading fast. The noise was constant now, echoing through the canyon like thunder. She lost track of time, lost track of fear. There was only the sound of gunfire, the taste of dust, and the smell of smoke. When the shooting finally paused, the silence felt almost unreal. She looked over at him. His face was pale, lips pressed tight. He glanced at her rifle. "You did good," he said softly. She tried to answer, but her voice broke. "How long do you think before they come again?" He wiped sweat from his brow. "Not long." The quiet didn't last. A shout went up outside, followed by the creak of wood. She peeked through the window and saw them dragging branches and brush toward the mission walls. Her stomach dropped. "They're setting fire." He cursed under his breath. "You have to move now." They grabbed what little they had, guns, canteens. A small pouch of bullet sand ran toward the back of the mission. Smoke was already curling around the broken windows, rising thick and fast. The heat built quickly, burning their lungs. They reached a narrow passage behind the chapel that led to the open hills. The man went first, checking the path. "Go," he said. "Stay close." She followed, choking on the smoke. Flames licked up the outer wall behind them, painting the sky red and gold. The roar of fire mixed with the shouts of the riders closing in. When they burst out onto the hillside, the wind hit them hard, cool and sharp. They didn't stop running until they reached a line of rocks higher up, where the land dropped away into a steep ravine. The view stretched far below, endless desert, smoke curling into the wind. He dropped to one knee, catching his breath. "We can't stay here long," he said. "They'll search the cliffs." She looked down the slope, her body shaking with exhaustion. "There's nowhere left to go." He turned his head toward the north, eyes narrowing. "There's one place." "What?" "An old mine," he said. "Just beyond that ridge." deep enough to hide till night. The thought of crawling into darkness made her stomach twist, but she nodded. We go. They moved again, each step slower, heavier. The trail wound between jagged rocks, the air filled with ash and grit. Behind them, the fire had swallowed the mission entirely, flames climbing high against the sky. As they reached the ridge, a sound cut through the wind, the distant echo of hooves again. They froze. The riders hadn't given up. He turned to her, eyes sharp and determined. When we reach the mine, you go in first. I'll cover the entrance. No, she said, voice trembling. Come with me. He shook his head. They'll follow the tracks. Someone has to draw them away. She stared at him, realizing what he meant. You'll die out here. He gave a small, tired smile. Maybe, but you and that child won't. Before she could argue, the sound of horses grew louder, closer than before. Dust rose over the ridge, a dark cloud against the afternoon sky. He pressed his rifle into her hands. Go, he said again. She hesitated, torn between fear and something deeper, an ache she didn't have words for. Then she turned and ran, clutching the rifle and the life inside her, as the wind carried the sound of pursuit closer and closer. Behind her, the first shots rang out again. Echoing through the canyon like a storm that refused to end, the wind howled through the canyon as she stumbled down the narrow path, the weight of the rifle heavy in her hands. Behind her, the sound of gunfire cracked again and again, echoing off the stone walls until it seemed to come from every direction. She wanted to look back, to see if he was still there, but fear kept her moving forward. Each shot cut through the air like a warning, each heartbeat pushing her toward the shadowy mouth of the mine up ahead. The entrance was small and half-collapsed, hidden behind a tangle of rocks and dry brush. She squeezed through the gap, her breath ragged, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Inside, the air was cool and still. She moved deeper, her hands tracing the rough stone, until she found a narrow space where she could crouch down and listen. The gunfire outside grew fainter, replaced by the distant rush of the wind. Then silence. A deep, heavy silence that made her chest tighten. She waited, counting the moments, hoping to hear his voice calling out. None came. Her hands trembled as she set the rifle down. She pulled her knees close, trying to steady herself. The child inside her shifted, a soft, small reminder that life still clung on. She whispered to the darkness, promising that she would not let fear win. Hours passed before she dared to move. The last light of day faded from the mouth of the mine, leaving her wrapped in shadows. When she finally stepped outside, the sky was streaked with red and purple. Smoke still hung low in the distance where the mission had burned. The valley looked empty now, quiet in a way that felt both peaceful and cruel. She scanned the ridge but saw no sign of movement, no riders, no man. Her chest ached at the thought that he might have fallen. Still, she couldn't let herself stop. She took one last look at the horizon, then began walking down the narrow trail that led toward the open plains. The night was long and cold. The moon rose high, lighting her path with a pale glow. Coyotes cried somewhere in the distance, their voices carrying across the dark hills. She walked until her legs felt numb, then found shelter beneath a cluster of rocks. She built a small fire and warmed her hands, the flickering flames casting soft light over her face. She thought of him then, the man who had fought for her, who had stayed behind so she and the child could have a chance. She remembered his quiet strength, the way he always looked toward the horizon as if searching for something that could not be seen. He had carried more burdens than most men could bear, yet he never gave up. In that moment, she understood that courage wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about standing your ground, even when you knew the odds were against you. When dawn came, the world looked softer. The smoke was gone, replaced by a calm, golden light stretching over the desert. She rose and began walking again, following the faint trail east. Each step was slower, but her resolve grew stronger. The memory of the man guided her, whispering that survival itself was an act of defiance. By midday, she reached a small stream winding through a grove of mesquite trees. She knelt beside it, cupping her hands to drink. The cold water filled her with new strength. She rested there, letting the sound of the stream drown out the memories of gunfire. Later that afternoon, she saw a thin line of smoke rising on the horizon, not the dark, choking kind of battle, but the soft gray of a cooking fire. Hope stirred in her chest. She followed it cautiously, every sense alert. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she saw a wagon and 2 horses. A small camp was set up beside a cluster of cottonwoods. A man was tending the fire, humming softly to himself. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and froze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he raised his hand slowly. "You look like you've come a long way," he said gently. She nodded, too tired to answer. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes were steady. He offered her water and a piece of bread. "Where you headed?" She hesitated, looking toward the open land stretching beyond the trees. "East," she said quietly. "Anywhere that's safe." He nodded with understanding. "Not many safe places left," he said. "Shh. But you're welcome to rest here a while." She accepted. As the day passed, she learned that the man was a traveler who traded goods between towns. He spoke little about himself, but his kindness was plain. He gave her a blanket, helped her clean the cuts on her hands, and made sure she ate. For the first time in days, she felt the weight in her chest ease. That night, as they sat by the fire, he asked softly, "Was there someone with you?" She looked into the flames. "Yes," she said after a long pause. He stayed behind. The man nodded, saying nothing more. Sometimes silence said enough. In the following days, she traveled with him across the plains. They moved slowly, following the river, until the land began to change, greener, softer, more forgiving. Each sunrise brought new colors to the sky, and with them, new strength to her heart. One morning, she woke to find the first signs of spring, a patch of wildflowers blooming beside the riverbank. She smiled, realizing that she had survived the winter of her life. The memory of the man was still with her, not as a wound, but as a quiet strength that carried her forward. Weeks later, they reached a small settlement nestled at the edge of a valley. Simple homes stood among fields of corn and wheat, and children played in the dust roads. The sound of laughter filled the air, so strange after so many days of silence. She felt her heart swell at the sight. An older woman came out to greet them, her eyes kind and knowing. "You look weary, child," the woman said, taking her hand. "Come inside. You'll find rest here." The warmth of that home felt almost unreal. They gave her food, clean clothes, and a soft bed to sleep in. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to close her eyes without fear. In the weeks that followed, she stayed with the settlers, helping in the fields and tending to the small children. The simple rhythm of life soothed her, reminding her that even after loss, the world found ways to begin again. When her time came, the people gathered around her, offering comfort and care. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, a quiet child, with dark eyes that seemed to hold the strength of the man who had saved them both. She named him Samuel, after a word she once heard the man say meant heard by God, every time she looked into her son's eyes. She felt a piece of that same courage reflected back at her. The settlement slowly became her home. She worked the fields, mended clothes, and sang to her child under the open sky. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the horizon glowed with gold, she would sit by the river, holding her son close, and remember the man who had fought to give them this peace. Years passed and her boy grew strong. He learned to ride, to plant, to build, and to listen to the stories of those who came through the valley. Sometimes when travelers spoke of the mountains or the burned ruins of the mission, she would listen quietly, her heart aching yet proud. She never spoke of what happened there, but she carried the memory in her heart like a sacred thing. As she grew older, the pain of those days softened into something deeper, quiet understanding that life's worth was measured not by how long it lasted, but by the courage it took to live it fully. She had lost much, but she had gained something even greater, the strength to keep going, the will to protect what mattered most. When her son asked one night about his father, she smiled and looked toward the stars. "He was a brave man," she said softly, "and everything good we have now is because of him." The boy nodded, his small hand finding hers. "Will we ever see him again?" She looked out into the endless dark, where the land met the sky. In a way, she whispered, "He's all around us." The fire crackled beside them, casting warm light over their faces. The wind carried the scent of the fields, the sound of the river, and the promise of another dawn. In that still moment, she felt peace, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that forgives. And when the first light of morning touched the valley, she knew that the story they had begun in fire and fear had found its true ending in love and endurance. The land that once echoed with gunfire now sang with life again, and in that simple, quiet world, her son's laughter carried farther than any sorrow ever could.